Now that we have a basic understanding of what actually happened in the Middle Ages, let's take a much closer look at the painting, sculpture, and architecture that derived from this very important period. We're going to start with painting. Now, as you would expect, since the medieval period was so dominated by the Christian church, clearly the painting is going to have a ton of Christian themes. And there were styles, like you could tell a German painting from a French painting from a Spanish painting, but they were still Christian themes, and illuminated manuscripts were definitely the beginning of painting everywhere across Europe. And as we talked about, this shows the intellectual side of art since it was coming mostly from the monks and the monasteries. Here are just a couple more examples of those beautiful illuminated manuscripts. You just can't underestimate how important they were in the early medieval period especially. So again, looking here, we see the overabundance of the gold, the blues, and the reds. What you don't see is a lot of backgrounds. That wasn't important. All we cared about was the figure himself, and they are still very boxed in, like enclosed in some way, just like medieval society itself. Now, a couple of other interesting things about illuminated manuscripts that I want you to pay attention to. Notice that oftentimes the figures themselves were not accurate. What I mean by that is like you might have one giant man in the middle, and then you might have a bunch of little short men all around them. They were not going for accuracy. What they cared about was importance. So whoever the tallest person in the painting was the person who was most important, which of course most of the time would be Jesus. Secondly, they did not care about exact details. And like I said, like backgrounds and settings and everything else totally didn't really matter to them. They just were trying to give me the figures themselves. We've already discussed the walled-in nature of this and how crowded the scenes tended to be, which again is a reflection of the way life was in this period. The same types of colors, golds, reds, and a lot of blues constantly showing up. And of course, the primary topic, Bible stories. They would oftentimes update them to contemporary settings. Now, that would mean like taking a story from the New Testament and then putting all the characters in medieval clothing, for example, but it was still the same stories, just made to be a little bit more recognizable to the people who'd be looking at the books. Now, after that early period, when we get into the late, what is known as the high medieval period, we get what's known as Gothic. And what's amusing is because originally the term Gothic was used in a derogatory sense. Like the people who were looking at this art were not impressed with it, didn't like it. They thought it looked like barbarians had done it, and so they called it Gothic as an insult. But the name stuck, and it now basically refers to the art, literature, and everything of the late medieval period. Now, the key theme of Gothic is emotion. They were trying very hard to capture emotion in a way that was not really present in the earlier period. And even though we are by no means fully developed here in terms of perspective or proportion or anything like that, it's not quite as flat as earlier works. And you'll see what I mean. I'll point it out in a second. Lastly, we see a little bit of a shift here in the Christian principles that are kind of governing society. The early part of the medieval period, especially during the Black Plague and all that in the middle of the medieval period, everything the church tended to do focused on judgment, that we deserve this punishment from God, that we deserve to suffer for our sins, and so forth. What we see happening in the Gothic period is a move away from that, where we're looking at a God who is merciful and a God who loves us and wants to care for us despite our sinful nature. And so because of that, we see also the Gothic paintings we're about to look at are different than the illuminated manuscripts that came before. The first major important person that I want you to pay attention to is a guy named C.M. Bouyer, and I love that name. And when you look at this portrait of Jesus, it's not hard to see the emotion I'm talking about. We look at his face and we see pain, we see suffering, we see, like his down look. So that emotion's coming through really well. But what we don't see here is realism. I mean, Jesus is golden. He doesn't reflect like some sort of natural skin color. We don't get backgrounds. All it is literally a cross and nothing behind it. And also, if you notice the little halo ring around Jesus's head. That's a very traditional hallmark of the medieval period, where the pictures wanted to tell you, okay, this guy is important, this guy is holy, so they would put kind of that golden disc around him, which obviously wasn't there in real life. But Sam Bouyer is starting to kind of create this Gothic mantra that's going to become really important as we continue. This is another one of Sam Bouyer's beautiful pieces. This is actually an altar piece, and you can see here a beautiful depiction of the sizes being kind of different from what you'd expect. We have the Virgin Mary big in the center. We have a Jesus, a baby Jesus, sitting on her lap. Now, looking at that baby, a lot of you might be looking at him and being like, he really doesn't look too much like a baby. He kind of looks like a 40-year-old man, just like shrunk down. That is another hallmark of medieval paintings. They weren't going for accuracy. Even though, when you picture a baby, normally his features are quite different, larger head, more pudgy, not much of a neck, so forth. They weren't going for that because they know that Jesus is eventually going to grow up. Therefore, he's just a short man. Okay? And if you look at all the people surrounding the Virgin Mary and Jesus, they're all relatively short in comparison to her. They're just not as important. Therefore, they were shrunk down. But the fact that they all have those little golden halos around their heads tells you, okay, these are all saints. These are all somebody holy, somebody important in the Christian church. Now, the next major guy to come along, and he takes a few baby steps ahead of Sam Bouyer, was a guy named Giotto. All right, and Giotto still is a medievalist. He's just starting to develop even more, towards what we would consider a modern point of view. Like, look at this lovely painting here in front of us. First thing, guy in the middle has a halo around him. That is Jesus, right? But unlike the way Sam Bouyer would have represented him, where Jesus would have been really tall and everybody else would have been really short, what we see with Giotto is he's taking a step towards modernism and trying to make everyone relatively the same size. We also get a little bit of detail, a little bit more color, a little bit more focus than we would have had with Sam Bouyer. Now, this is Giotto's altarpiece, and as you can see, it's very similar in content to the one we just looked at by Sam Bouyer. It's got the Virgin Mary in the middle, Jesus in the middle on her lap, and then everybody else kind of surrounding him. And even though there is more emotion and a little bit more realism here, we still see that the majority of the stylistic aspects of Sam Bouyer have not gone away. It's still overwhelmingly gold and red. We still have the halos. We still have a short little 40-year-old man on the lap instead of a real baby-like person. And we also still have everyone else in the picture being relatively short. So even though Giotto was starting to make changes, we are by no means to what we would consider a more modern representation of this period. Now, sculpture is where we see a huge change throughout the medieval period. And frankly, it was not popular at all for the first couple hundred years of the medieval period. It just didn't happen. And there's really two big reasons for that. First of all, they looked back in history, and the last people who had sculpture were the Romans. And of course, for the majority of their period, the Romans were not Christian. They were pagan. And so a lot of the people in the medieval period look back and they're like, we don't want to be like those pagans. We're Christian now. Therefore, we can't have sculpture. Okay? Secondly, there is something in the Bible that talks about how people should not worship idols, that we should not look at an image and pray to it or anything like that. And so the church fathers were very concerned that if we had a lot of sculptures everywhere in our churches and our cities, that people might be breaking that rule, that they actually might turn these into idols and pray to them instead of praying to Christ or to God the way the Bible intends. And so literally, they just didn't happen, very, very rare. And it wasn't until late in the period that we start seeing sculpture. When we do start getting its examples are like this. What you can see here is that really at first it's very reminiscent of an illuminated manuscript. It's boxed in, it's crowded, it's small, it's not, at all what we can kind of conceive of as a statue today. And so even then they started doing it, you can see they were kind of limited in their worldview to what they were doing with art. That's what they kept doing with sculpture. What they also did was, when they did start using statues and sculpture, is they started doing it to incorporate into the church itself. For example, if you look at the picture on the left, what you see is actually a church door, and it's a little bit rusty. It's certainly not as polished as it would have been back in the day, but as you can see, they actually took the door, broke it up into little sections, and they're telling the Bible story to non-readers, because obviously the majority of people coming to church could not read the Bible, even if there was a copy available for them to look at. So when they did start using statuary, it was kind of a slow process, and they were using it for very didactic purposes. Let's teach the people about the Bible. Everyone will be fine. The picture on the right is a close-up of another one of those doors with the same type of effect, where they're telling a story. But what we do not see in the statuary is any sort of depth, not a lot of detail, and certainly not anything that's freestanding. That doesn't come for a very long time. Last little piece I wanted to show you is just an example of an altarpiece that they made out of, a carving. And again, it's flat. It's not at all realistic. We have, a big Virgin Mary in the middle with a short little 40-year-old version of Jesus on her lap. But we are starting to basically take baby steps towards full-blown statuary. We're just not there yet. By the time we get to the very end of the Gothic period, the same changes we saw in painting start making their way into sculpture. We're looking for calm. We're looking for peace. Remember, this is a God now who we focus on his mercy, not on his judgment from the earlier period. And we still want to be learning from it. And that is why they are telling stories, and they're basically conveying it to a non-educated populace. But we were not doing sculpture at all for art's sake. We were not doing sculpture at all just to decorate or to beautify anything. It was purely secondary. It was purely there just for decoration. This is a wonderful example. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, there's a portrait, again, of the Virgin Mary cradling the broken body of Jesus after the crucifixion. Okay, this is one of the earliest statues, freestanding statues, that we actually have from the Gothic period. And even though it's obvious what they're conveying, you have to admit it's not the most artistically beautiful piece. Like, it's not exactly realistic. It doesn't have a ton of features, the accuracy of it. And you do get emotion. I mean, you can definitely sense Mary's sadness and obviously, Jesus's pain, but it's not as fully formed, so to speak, as what's going to come. Now, the picture on the right shows you the more common use of statues, where they were basically glued to the wall of cathedrals, so that as people were going in, they could kind of look up and learn something about the faith that they had to believe on their way to church. Lastly, we're going to look at architecture. Architecture is the one area that was really, really massive throughout the medieval period. And when you look at the earliest stages, what they really cared about was grandeur. Bigger is better. If we can make it bigger, we're obviously more awesome. That was kind of the logic. And they essentially copied styles from other parts of the world. They were not original here. They were just, taking what other people were doing and making it bigger. That way, everyone knew that they were impressive. This is a wonderful example from that early medieval period. This is actually Charlemagne's church. This is where he would go to service. This is where he would do it. And it's extremely tall. You can kind of get a sense of that here. But otherwise, if you look at it, this church is not, uniquely or identifiably European. It has arches, just like the ancient Romans and Greeks did. It has a lot of gold, just like all the churches in Greece were doing. It's got a lot of, geometry and columns, just like the ancients did. I mean, honestly, this is very derivative of what came earlier. We just made it taller, so woohoo for us. The first truly unique style of architecture that does develop in the medieval period is called Romanesque. And what's interesting about that is because the name actually means Rome-like. So they are still looking to their history, and they are still trying to kind of grab on to the glory that was Rome. But in Romanesque, they have taken it and developed it in such a way that it is uniquely European. It's uniquely medieval in a way that the Romans themselves wouldn't have done. What we see here is they They love the arch, so we have lots of arched doorways. We have some windows, but we don't have a lot. And what the buildings tended to be described as are massive, static, and lightless. Okay, they are building these buildings so huge, so massive, that they have to have extremely thick walls in order to kind of support their weight. And because of that, we can't have a lot of windows in there because that would weaken the wall. It wouldn't be able to be strong enough to actually support the structure. And so as a result of that, what we ultimately get are a lot of really huge, but really dark and damp and cold churches on the inside. But the real beauty of the Romanesque comes from the more metaphorical representation. This was the church kind of telling everyone in Europe, this is how important we are. This is how, massive we are. We're building these huge, massive structures. And of course, they would become the center of, each little European city that would flourish around it. Now, the other interesting thing about Romanesque is that this is the first time that a specific building style is basically introduced, and that is what we call the Latin cross. And I gave you a picture of that on the right. It's exactly what it sounds like. Build the church to look like a cross. And that way, not only are we telling people about the truth of Christianity, not only are we giving them sculptures on the designs of it outside so they can see it even if they can't read it, we're literally building it into the actual construction of the buildings themselves. It's a very kind of all-encompassing style. This is a wonderful example of a Romanesque church. And when I say massive and static, you see what I mean. Like huge, huge, tall buildings, which were impressive in this period. But look at how few windows there really are. I mean, the front has very few, only a handful on the bottom, and then the one big central window that pretty much every church would have. But other than that, it was a pretty blank slate. The inside is exactly what you'd expect because of that. Even though it was tall, it was dark and it was kind of foreboding in some ways. And think about how cold a lot of Northern European countries get in the wintertime. This is not going to be a particularly warm place to hang out for Sunday service. And so we have Romanesque almost feeling a bit oppressive, which frankly goes along a little bit with the way the church was in the early Middle Ages when they were kind of taking over and restructuring society. The highlight of architecture, though, comes from the Gothic cathedral. This is where beauty and sympathy really come into play. And even though Romanesque had dominated for a couple of hundred years, when Gothic comes in, it totally takes over. It's a clear break from that, which means we're still going to be big, but we're going to be light. We're going to be airy. And the church realized something. At the same time that they're switching away from judgment to mercy, they realized that church is truly the one place each week that the poor peasants can come and have a break from how difficult their life is. Therefore, that's what the church should represent. It should be beautiful. It should be airy. It should be a place of comfort. And it should basically distract people from how miserable their lives were elsewhere. And it's in this period that we start to see a lot of the features that we kind of identify with churches nowadays. This is when we get beautiful rose windows and stained glass. This is when sculpture is really being used. It showed up a little bit in Romanesque, but we get really decorated now with the sculpture. And I mentioned flying buttresses. All that is, that's a support system to hold up the walls. The reason this matters is because of that. I can have more windows. They made like an engineering advance where they figured out how to support walls more safely so I can have windows, which means I can have light. And we start getting a lot more paintings, especially of the altars inside. The most famous Gothic cathedral is Notre Dame. And of course, that's what we have represented here. It's in Paris. And it beautifully exemplifies many aspects of what a Gothic cathedral should look like. First of all, in the very dead center, we have that big circle. That's called the rose window. We saw those in Romanesque, but as you can see, this is a lot more kind of ornate and decorated. And we're going to see a picture from the inside in a moment where you can see really how colorful it is. You don't see that from the outside. Looking at it, you can see how there's a lot more use of the sculpture to decorate the exterior. You can see that there's a lot more windows from the front and especially along the sides, which you can't see in this particular case. Now, one way that this is unusual for a Gothic cathedral is actually the two little spires on top, where they're kind of looking like almost like Lego blocks. They match almost identically. That was actually unusual, and I'm going to show you a picture in a moment where that's not the case. But, the whole idea here is you should be happy to be going to church and to spending time in here. This is actually a more typical Gothic cathedral that you would see, and as you can tell, this is quite different from Notre Dame. We still see the abundance of windows. We still see the beautiful, intricate rose window in the center, but what is noticeably different are the spires. They are very constructed in very different styles. This is normal, and this became the norm for a couple of reasons. First of all, you have to realize how long it would take for these buildings to be constructed. Literally, we're talking a couple hundred years, generally speaking, from initial design to actual completion. Well, over a couple hundred years, styles change. And so for one thing, they probably just constructed the first spire earlier than the other, and they had just made changes from a stylistic standpoint. Secondly, though, was the ideal of perfection. If they actually built both of the spires exactly identical, where they were just the same, exactly the same, they actually viewed that as an affront to God. Only God can be perfect, is what they believed. Therefore, we on earth shouldn't even try to mimic that, because that is literally going to be an insult to the perfection that we can never achieve. Therefore, this was the actual style that they incorporated most often. This is the interior of Notre Dame. And just like I was saying, it's so light and airy. Look at it. You can see the light flooding in. You can see kind of how intricate and detailed a lot of the sculpture became. And this was a much more uplifting, positive atmosphere, basically, for the peasants. This is the picture of the inside of that rose window. I told you, it's actually all color. This picture doesn't even truly do it justice. It actually is really vibrant with color. But that was from the inside looking out. And so again, we're motivating people, come in to this beautiful, light, airy place, and you'll be kind of blinded and surrounded by all these beautiful colors. Stained glass comes in, and just like the statuary, it has a very specific purpose. Our members of the church cannot read. Therefore, we need to tell them the stories of Scripture in visual form. And so, literally, this becomes an art form unto itself, where they're adding detail and beauty and color and light to the pictures. And when people are sitting in church listening to the pastor, they actually are surrounded by the stories themselves kind of coming to life. Finally, if you ever get the chance to go to Paris, you need to visit Sainte-Chapelle. That's the church that you see in front of you. It is a beautiful depiction of just how far we have come with Gothic cathedrals in the medieval period. This church is just absolutely bathed in blue light when you walk in, and it literally depicts every single book of the Bible. And so look how far we've come from that Romanesque, that solid block-like church, to this, where ordinary people can come in and just be amazed at the beauty of Christianity and not just focus on the drudgery of it. This concludes the second lecture of this week.